Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, William Kentridge, Prints, Process and Practice. My name is Sarah Sinisi, and I am a Senior Specialist at Aspire Art Auctions. And tonight we are joined by two incredible women who are very knowledgeable about William Kentridge and his works and his prints. Firstly, let me introduce Jillian Ross. Jillian is a leading South African master printer. She has been the master printer and director of the David Crit workshop in Johannesburg for the past 16 years and has worked with over 100 artists, her most notable ongoing collaboration being with William Kentridge, with whom she has completed numerous major collaborations, including a number of works that we are going to be looking at this evening. And in 2020, Jillian returned to Canada whilst developing new relationships and projects in Canada, such as soon to be released collaborative print project at the University of Alberta with William Kentridge. Ross will be strengthening her old ones in South Africa by continuing her inclusive collaborative work with the David Crit workshop and other print partners. And secondly, I'm going to introduce Tammy Langtry. Tammy is currently working as an independent curator and cultural producer. She most recently worked as an assistant curator at SAST Museum of Contemporary African Art, where in 2019, she was an assistant curator on the William Kentridge survey, Why Should I Hesitate? Putting Drawings to Work. Tammy is currently developing a Pan-African Artist Residency, LARPA, a co-conceptualized project with the Visual Arts Network of South Africa and the Goethe Institute. Now, tonight, our panelists are going to be discussing Kentridge's printmaking practice, particularly in relation to the 10 print lots featured on Aspire's upcoming auction in Cape Town on the 30th of September. And what is particularly exciting is that these lots not only span 3 decades of printmaking, but they also showcase a range of printmaking techniques. And Tammy and Jillian are going to conceptualize these works for us a bit, but they're also going to explain some of the technical aspects of the printmaking process. So we are going to start off this evening by looking at 2 screen print artworks. And move on to the screen prints. There we go. And the first print that we're going to look at is The Battle Between Yes and No from 1989. And secondly, we've got Rumors and Impossibilities. That's a little bit of a later work from 2010. And I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Tammy, who's going to speak a little bit about screen printing in South Africa in relation to Kentridge's works. Tammy.
Thank you. And I guess I just want to first say thank you to Aspire Art Auctions for this moment and to Jill for joining or letting me join in this conversation. I know it will be quite full in terms of the technicalities of printmaking and the importance of the different processes. And I'm just here to give a little bit of context to certain elements. And I think looking at these images particularly, and I love that you've kind of put them together in this way. You're looking at a work from 1989 and then next to that a work from 2010, and even just observing them, you can see kind of technical elements that might be similar, visual elements that might be similar. Looking specifically at the one on the left, The Battle Between Yes and No, I think these are part of an extended series that Kentridge produced outside of the Drawings for Projection series, which were made, film series, which was made between 1989 and 2003. And in some ways it formalizes a way of working, the model negotiations between yes and no, the color as symbolic, and then the textures and layering of the images between what we see in the foreground and the kind of backdrop of the image itself. As I mentioned, this series is taken from the Drawings for Projection film series, which looks at Felix Teitelbaum and his wife in this image in a tongue entanglement, as what I'm calling it. And I mean, I think I like to think about screen printing as a way of new media proliferating and industrializing information in a way. You know, how these come to be, Jillian, I think will touch on more. But I think it sits neatly between or straddles between questions of propaganda and questions of anti-authoritarian image making. And if we look particularly in South Africa during the 80s, screen printing was a very important part of the political uprising in South Africa, an anti-apartheid tool in a way. And art centers and printing studios were very much a central role in the making of images during that time. And I think it's interesting to see how the printing studio kind of constantly plays that role in terms of making culture. But I just want to add this notion of discontent that was very important in screen printing in the 80s and 90s in terms of the anti-apartheid movement. Screen printers would work with, or artists would work with activists in order to construct images. And I'm sure if you think back to what were those political images, you know, clenched fists, police vehicles, they had a very particular reference during that time. Whereas here we see something slightly different. It's almost the negotiation of the discontent of the yes and the no, and what answer comes out of that, or what decision comes out of that. And I particularly like that next to this work, refuse the point perspective. And when you think about point perspective, it's about how something almost becomes a vanishing point in a drawing. If you think of a road leading off into the distance, that vanishing point almost goes to nothing. And so again, the image I like to think about between these two is the question of, are things opening, or these questions and things we're navigating opening, or they're closing visually? And I think these are the types of questions that Kentridge is constantly returning to. And also, again, the idea that the work from 1989 still has these very important, strong visual references that continue throughout his printmaking process. Obviously, the one on the right comes from both the nose and refuse the hour. So again, has other projects that kind of sit underneath it or come after it. And yeah, I just think there's a beautiful pair that's been proposed. Yeah.
Thanks, Tammy. Jillian, should we move on to looking at how some of the screen printing actually works? I know you've got some exciting props.
I often, hi everybody, and thanks very much for having me today. I love talking about Williams prints. I love talking about the technical aspects. I love providing information on some of the collaborative printmaking studios that exist in South Africa and in different parts of the world. They are community spaces. They are places to try something new, to try something maybe you've been looking at for so long that you need somebody else's perspective. I think placing these two silkscreen pieces side by side, as Tammy says, you can see so many similarities from 1989 and to 2010. Both were printed at Caversham Press by Malcolm Christian. Both are large, 1.6 by 1 meter, nothing short of a feat, actually. In printmaking processes, often we start with smaller projects that give us an idea as to how to work in a much larger scale. And Malcolm has kind of blows you out of the water, both with the colors that they work in. Between William and Malcolm, the printmaker, they would have come up with a range of colors that actually need to be printed. And then William creates drawings in layers, almost like Photoshop for silkscreen. And I always have props because sometimes it's a little bit easier to show people how it's done. But a silkscreen, oops, sorry everybody. This is a silkscreen. So it's an aluminum panel, sometimes it's a wooden panel, and your drawing is made on an acetate and is actually with a photosensitive emulsion, your drawing is placed here on the screen. So this one is a cat my son made a little while ago. And much like Photoshop, one color per area of the screen. So you block this one out and print the cat with a little tiny squeegee. Lay it down on a table and you pull the ink through the screen like that. So just like Photoshop, you're just working with tools, big screens. The larger the print, the much larger the squeegee and the screens. So from a technical point of view, the larger you go, the harder it gets. Hope that answers some of the questions as to how silk screens get made.
Shall we move on to Linocut? Linocut is the next section we are looking at. But before we go into this, I also just want to mention to people that if you have any questions, make a note. And at the end of the presentation, we will have a small kind of period set aside where we can look at any questions that anyone has. But for now, let's move on to our Linocut. And we have 3 very exciting sets of etchings, all from the Universal Archive series. And that was printed, or it began being printed at the David Critt workshop in 2012. And on this one, I'm going to hand over to you first, Jillian, to take us through some of this project. And I think, Jillian, you were very involved in a lot of the printing of these works too.
I had the privilege of working on this entire body of work. Tonight's feature are cats and different versions of cats that are found in the Linocut project titled the Universal Archive. William was writing a series of lectures for Harvard University titled the Norton Lecture Series. And they were a series of lectures for over an hour each, 6 lectures in total. And he was writing about his studio practice. He was writing about it from, the first lecture is about his shadow processions and how conceptually they come to be. The second lecture is about Africa in his work. Third lecture is about Johannesburg in his work. The 4th lecture is about studio practice and what the studio means in the greater scheme of his working process. And he wrote these lectures every morning. And in the afternoon, he continued to draw and was working on his operatic projects and film projects, drawings, sculpture, anything else. When it came to the 5th lecture, so he had 2 lectures left, and he said he had absolutely no idea what to do. And William paces the studio when he's thinking. I find I do exactly the same thing. He talks about work in your peripheral vision. So we're pinning things up around us as we're working, and most artists do that. A reference to I don't know, could be a photograph, can be, as you can see behind me, hand painting samples, different colors, can be notes from friends, can be almost anything. So when you're pacing the studio, your peripheral vision kind of picks up on everything that's around you. And William had a new paintbrush. Again, props, I always have props. He had a new paintbrush and an old one. And the older they are, when you don't take care of your brushes, they kind of are crispy. And so he started a series of ink drawings on dictionary pages. And one morning, he just started painting them. And he calls it productive procrastination. And he invited me down to the studio, and he had 20 works up on the wall that he had, using ink, he painted onto these dictionary sheets. And there were single page drawings. And then, as you can see, even in the page that's here on the screen right now, they're vertical drawings, they're horizontal drawings, there's 2-page drawings, and William was just playfully painting. That one morning that he calls productive procrastination turned into a series of prints that we worked on from the years 2012 till 2015. We worked on, I think, up to 75 images. Some range from single sheets on the dictionary page, 2 sheets, 4 sheets, 6 sheets, 15, up to 104 sheets of paper. And what I think is highlighted so beautifully with the cats that you have tonight is not only what a line can be drawn. If you see these in the real, Linocut is a piece of linoleum floor tile. We carve the surface of it, and we'll show you a few images from the David Kroot print studio that we working on the series and how we started. So here you can see carving. At first, we glued William's drawings actually onto the lino plates so that we could carve as true to his likeness of Mark into the plate as possible. What that means, however, is when you're creating a plate, when you print it onto paper, it comes out in reverse. So in this case, not only did we end up discarding William's drawings because we carved through them and then actually threw them away, but everything came out in reverse, which over the course of time, we actually just started putting a photocopy transfer of some of William's drawings straight onto the linoleum. And we, instead of using very crude tools that are often used in Linocut, because Linocut can be very expressive depending on the tool that you use. And often it's about the kind of wave that might be within a mark or the width. In this case, it was using tiny copper engraving tools so that we could actually follow meticulously the ink splatter, if there might be, to try to get the gesture of the mark that William created in the ink drawing into a piece of linoleum. So a number of different people were involved in the project over the course of those 5 years, because each plate, so on a single sheet, would take anywhere up to 20 hours for carving. And the idea of this project was that we could provide the feel of William's idea. It wasn't about who carved the plates. It was everything had to do with how meticulously you could get the gesture of the mark. The ink sat perfectly on these dictionary pages. Every sheet, so if you go into the next image for me here, this is the ink that is for Linocut. You actually, it's printing relief. So it's your top marks. It's not the recesses like other processes are. So this is what the ink drawing looks like, or sorry, the inked linoleum plate. And it's all about the sound that to get the right amount of ink, you have to be able to hear a sloshing sound. So we're often talking about the smells of the printmaking studio, the sounds, and then you know you have the right amount of ink. And then for the next slide, you run it through the press. Thank you. And then it comes out onto the dictionary page in reverse. So the Universal Archive consists of coffee pots, cats, trees, figures, large trees, 5 different types of trees, the simplicity of a tree, which is almost just one line that's left, a coffee pot. The very first drawing we saw there was still a coffee pot, but it very much looks like a Chinese character. So it's an expressive typewriters. It consists of so many different images, actually. And then the playful nature of which William started to approach the works as the technicians got better and better in creating these gestural marks. The drawings got more and more detailed. So if you go on to the next slide as well, here you see that 10 small little plates lined up next to us that are already carved. You can see the color of the linoleum plates. Literally, it comes off a big giant roll. It's a plastic, it's a hard plastic. And then you can see the image in the back where 2 of us are carving a much bigger piece of linoleum. And then to the next one. You can see the body of work as it starts to progress. So up to a year later, we're working on printing each of these particular editions. Every piece is unique. Every little sheet of dictionary here, there's 48 images that are on single pages. 4 of them are cats. One of them is a reference back to the scribble cat etching that we made at DKW in 2010. One of them is a cat that's lying back. William often talks about how beautifully expressive cats are, whereas dogs are just a nose. So it's much more beautiful actually drawing cats. The cats behind you, Sarah, are, I think when we get to them just in a moment here, I'll show you how they get made. This is one We made 5 different versions of this cat. This one actually wasn't printed on shorter Oxford Dictionary as some of the others were, but this one was printed on a thesaurus. And so if you go to the next one, sorry. the 4 cats that are behind Sarah there, and one other one, so there's 5 in total, are all made from the 4, nope, sorry, keep going ahead. Are all made from the same 4 sheets of linoleum. So here you can see a cat's tail, a cat's back, a leg, and a face. And then if you go back one more, you can see another cat's body with feet, an arch, kind of all the parts that make up a cat. And then what we did was that William would actually just sit there. We printed them all, and he would just sit there and tear them up. And then he would just arrange them on the table for me in any way that he saw fit. And then he would put little red registration marks so that I knew which way to align them. So again, if we flip forward a little bit, can show you how we kind of make this together. So William sits in there and he's just, you know, there's something about the preciousness of a drawing. And when William's working on an idea, that preciousness goes away. It's the way in which he works. He talks about a safe space for stupidity. He talks about playful nature of printmaking. I have interns that come and work at David Crouch that I often had tear up the reject print so that they could understand what it felt like to tear up a work of art. We pride ourselves in being playful and in also understanding that the very nature of an edition is that everything is much the same. So in this case, these prints, sometimes William makes unique works in some of the editions, and these cats were just kind of, I guess, adding to that uniqueness. So he came into the studio, tears them all up, places them on a sheet of paper, and then I have to figure out the problem of piecing them back together. So then if you go to the next slide, we make a series of little plastic templates that just allows us to place the template on top of the sheet of dictionary, see the image underneath it, and then tear around it. And so we get much the tear marks. These look like very funny pictures of like these museum layouts. Like, what is this? But these are all the little tiny templates. Every cat has to be replicated for an edition, so we have to understand how to remake them. And these are all the torn pieces. So often in a printmaking archive, especially, these kind of templates and working materials are present. They're often there for an audience to be able to actually see too. So this is then the acetate map that we start, that I trace out so that I know how to piece each of the pieces together. Every project I've worked on with William, one leads itself into the next. So with an understanding of how William tears sheets of paper here and how to put them together, I'm able to grow and to understand how to enlarge that. So when he wants to work on a much bigger piece later on, we already have some sort of an understanding. We already trust our hands, the way we've taped down the sheets of paper. And in this case, every layer, one layer that sits on top of another, has to be reinforced because they all hang. They're not glued straight down onto the sheet of paper. There's a little bit of movement that's allowed on these dictionary pages. So then if you go into the next slide, it just shows you here how the layering works. And then how the editioning works. So these, what was amazing is signing these works with William, the word associations that would go with each of the pieces. In one of them, the thesaurus was talking about a cat. You find it within the cat, sitting underneath its arm is the literal definition of what it is. In other pieces, there was something called an ice blink. So William and I discussed what an ice blink actually was. Some of the word associations with some of the imagery in this particular body of work. It's quite wonderful to unpack. I hope that answers questions.
Thanks, Jillian. Tammy, should we move over to you for some of your thoughts on on these works before we move on to the next?
I'm gonna make
section?
I'm gonna make a very small
Thanks.
comment. I think Jillian has kind of outlined very beautifully how an initial stage of like building this printing process or this way of thinking actually might begin. I think we maybe as viewers of Kentridge's work, we're used to, or we're very familiar with these animals, the cat, the rhino, the coffee pot, you know, these become their own alphabet almost, or their own archive to Kentridge's practice. And I like what you said. I think Kentridge talks to always the gesture of a line. If a line is animated, what is the gesture? What is the personality? How can we think through drawing as a way of animating the world rather than seeing it as one static place? And I think the preciousness of the image is an important thing to consider, and this kind of methodical and anarchistic way of approaching the image. I think it replicates itself in the way that he deals with forms of history, forms of monument making, just ways that we imagine the world. And so I think that tearing is a really beautiful gesture. I was going to read something from the Norton lectures actually, in the way that he approaches the preciousness of a book and the preciousness of information. But I won't go there because I think we have lots more to talk about.
We do have lots more to talk about. Thank you, Tammy. We're going to move on next to our, it's the last technique that we're looking at, etching, but we've got 5 etching lots that we are going to have a look at. And I'm going to start off quickly just running through 3. All of these works are from 2007. We've got William Kentridge prints. And then this Untitled 1 to 4 from the Magic Flute series. And then the last one, Linea Garibaldi Avanzata, also from 2007. And then I think that, Jillian, I'm going to pass over to you first on these works and on etching.
Sometimes I find etching to be the most complicated, really, in trying to talk about. So silkscreen is very known for color, actually. So it's a layering, but it's also an easy way of, not easy, sorry, none of these techniques are actually very easy in some senses. And that's why collaborative studios, that's why artists work with collaborative studios, is you have technical support so that somebody has an understanding of the technical medium so that you don't have to figure out the technical as well as the idea, the concept of the works. The misunderstanding often is that the artist is making a reproduction of something, and what we were showing you there through the images from the Linocuts is you can see that the artist is working on the plates. The artist works with the tools, works directly onto the plates, and with any of these media, the artist is directly involved. It's a conversation between a printer. So a master printer just means you have a handle on the technique. You've been working in the printmaking studio for at least 10 years, more likely. I've been doing this since 2003. So we've explored a number of different techniques. All the while we're working on one project simultaneously to the other. I think that's when you even introduce these 3 projects. These all happen more or less in the same time, and at the same time that we are working on the Nose series with William. So we the Magic Flute series of small pieces, this one here. This series was made at the same time as the Magic Flutes book. Flute was published by David Kurt Publishing. And so William was working on his first operatic project, the Magic Flute. And these are 4 little studies that were created at the time of we were working on the book publication. This is one of the first projects I was working on with William. The piece before that was made for the William Kentridge Prints publication, also 2006. So it was a book just on William's prints. And William made a small edition of these, which I believe is even 10. And this is done just by scratching into the surface of a copper plate. William uses a diamond tip tool, so it's a very sharp tool. But what William can do with that tool is amazing because he allows his hand to move with it. And copper has a resistance sometimes that you don't understand until you work with it quite often. And William just kind of moves through it. And he doesn't force the copper, but he has a particular way of scratching into it. And then he knows how to erase those marks and how to add to them. And when we're working in this technique with William, we ink when you scratch into copper, the copper that you scratch has to go somewhere. So what it does is it kind of pushes itself on top of the plate. And then ink can actually sit all the way rather than in this small little line any longer. So you get a very soft, beautiful mark, which you can see in the rhino's horns and you can see underneath his stomach especially. So if you move through a few more slides for me, this is how we started the Insorabile, I can never say it, Insorabile Avanzata series. This is a process called sugar lift. Etchings are all created on metal plates, predominantly on copper plates because they're softer. So when an artist is scratching into the surface, like I was talking about, that technique is called dry point. And the harder the metal, the harder that is, the more resistance it provides an artist, which just makes it harder to make an image. And in this case, this is a process called sugar lift. And this is William painting on a blank, shiny sheet of copper with sugar. And in this case, it's condensed milk mixed with India ink so that he can see it. You paint, you can see how beautifully this expressive painting is placed on this little copper sheet. It's only about this big. So if you go into the next slide for me. Once you've painted with the sugar, you put the brown tar that you see here is called a hard ground. And it's a mixture of asphaltum, petroleum jelly in some cases, beeswax. And it just, you put it over top of the whole plate, including the condensed milk. And then you let that dry, you place it into water and the sugar lifts. So what it does is it exposes the positive area of William's painting, as you can see here, so that you can put a tooth onto that, which is called an aquatint, and you drop it into an acid bath. And you etch it for 2 minutes, so you get a light gray. You etch it for 10 minutes, so you get a darker gray, 20 minutes for black. And so you're working always in reverse. But in this case, it allows an artist's drawing, sugar lift or lift ground. Sometimes they're the same technique, just means it's been drawn, the artist has drawn a positive image in some sort of a sugar solution so that you can lift it off after. If you go to the next image, here too, William, this is a really good example of how William works in printmaking all the time. These were small drawings that were eventually made into this series of works. And you can see the gas mask figure, especially there. In these, at the top there, you see the 4 drawings that he made as studies, small little drawings that then we made into the series of prints, of 2 of which you can see in the bottom left there. You can see how everything's in reverse. So it's the same for editions. We make plates. The reason we do that is so we can make more than one. But if you're making a plate, when you print it onto a sheet of paper, after running it through a press, it's backwards. So if the artist wishes that the image is a particular way as it turns out, then they have to draw it backwards, which often means that the small nuances, if your drawings tilt to the right, they'll come out to the left and so on, which is quite difficult. Some artists don't like the fact that this is not controlled. Some artists don't like seeing their drawing in reverse. William talks about it being a gift to the artist, seeing the print that comes out the other side of the press, because it comes out differently than you expect. And here's just a nice example to show you how differently the prints turn out to the drawings. And then the next slide for me, please. And here you can see William's drawing. This is Nose 30, a print series that we were making simultaneously to these others, is where you can see William's drawing on the left and then his painted copper plate on the right. So in this case, he did want it to come out exactly the way he'd drawn it. So he painted it in reverse on the copper plate. And then the next one, please. Here you can just see all the materials that he's using that are around him, and he's just painting. Small little tiny paintbrush. And the next one. How beautiful they are. You can see, and then the drawings that come later. The larger scale drawings that come from the smaller prints. So in this case, this is a really nice project to talk about how there's a small drawing at first, so sketch. Then we made the prints, and from those prints, he actually projected them up onto the wall to make the larger drawings that then were featured in an Italian newspaper for over 5 consecutive weeks.
I'm thinking, should we just quickly go, before we move on to the next etching, let's quickly go back up to the top to the William Kentridge prints. I know, Tammy, you had some thoughts on this one that we can look at before we move on to the next one.
I mean, I saw these as part of online as part of a beautiful exhibition called Double Vision. It was really exploring kind of etymology of images. And from what I understand, William was specifically researching and referencing Albrecht Dürer's prints of rhinos. And he's a German painter. Albrecht Dürer is a German painter, printmaker, and German Renaissance theorist. And he drew in a woodcut print what was seen to be the first image of a rhino in Lisbon in the 18th century. So there was this kind of first time ever seeing, and his version was very fantastical. It had like armor on it. It had a horn at the back of its head. It was this very unbelievable rhino, which at the time was very popular, and this image was circulating quite a lot. And I think in very interesting ways, again, speaks about the significance of the image and what holds the truth of the image. And so the study of the rhino was kind of thinking through Dürer's work and how images proliferate in some way. Yeah, it's quite a beautiful image, as Jillian mentioned. But if you want to go to the l'insoriabile avanzata, which everyone kind of struggles with at some point, all of us South Africans and Americans kind of struggle with. But yeah, as Jillian mentioned, this series was done on a kind of residency looking at a particular Italian and Ethiopian history during the 1930s, where Italy invades Ethiopia and the kinds of atrocities that might have happened at the time. And in some way, he was connecting a piece of history that we might want to forget with a new form of image making, perhaps, connected to the newspaper. So he was working with a newspaper, and as Joel said, these were 5 images that were put out each week in trying to reflect and remember these atrocities. So they were referencing paintings by Giotto di Bondone, and I believe the middle image, the top middle image, was looking at what could be a newspaper kind of bleeding in all of these images that we really struggle to face and to look at and to think about. Whereas the gas mask was looking at the gassing of Ethiopian civilians in the war of that period. And then below, and I think, Joel, you mentioned this in a previous talk, was that below on the right-hand side is kind of, once you filter through these images, how does that newspaper look after you've seen and kind of digested all of this really horrendous information? And so again, kind of a small scale way of approaching particular histories, approaching image making from these histories, and trying to understand it and unpack it and make the image anew in a way to deal with it again, which I think nicely leads on to some of the later work that we have in the slot.
Yeah, I think maybe go down to the West Coast landscapes. This is the next work that we're going to have a look at. This one is from a little bit later, 2010, West Coast landscapes. And Tammy, I think you're going to run us through a little bit about this landscape.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I believe this was done as a reflection of the Swartland region and looking at a particular wine farm in the area. And I think William is often reflected on landscapes and landscapes maybe as a monument. I mean, in Johannesburg, we have mine dumps as our mountains, and they hold their own memory and kind of history of this place and what has happened. And similarly in the Western Cape, I'm from Cape Town, and you know, the winelands are very significant kind of landscape, and they impart a kind of memory of colonial history. But rather than just depicting the landscape, William animates them with these incredible characters. You know, we have to be reminded of the top left of the windmill, of the succotaur that cut the vines. So these landscapes are never empty, they're never, you know, without memory or intrusion of the form or the figure or what might be part of that landscape. Yeah, so really beautiful series, and again, I think or a return to that idea of the landscape and what memory they hold.
Thank you, Tammy. Jill?
From a technical point of view, this particular series is bigger, larger in format, and a little bit more technically challenging, I guess, than the previous ones. As we were working on, we had at this point in time finished the nose series of 30 etchings, Lunsoria Brile, Avanzata, the Magic Flute series, all in etchings. I had been running David Crude workshop or been working in the studio there for 4 years at this point. And so these works are, again, sugar lift. So William started with painting with condensed milk on each of these. And then there was a second plate added to 3 out of these images, which has a more painterly quality, which is called spit bite. And instead of putting a copper plate into an etching bath, you actually start painting with the acid on top of the plate. So you put an aqua tint on it so it holds a tooth, and then you just start playfully painting. So in the world on the hind legs, the secature and the woman figure, those are painting with acid in the background. And the landscape and the windmill in the top left there are actually slightly different. So I put in some slides. If you put in, William hand painted a number of these prints as we were making them. And so he would test out painting techniques so that we could figure out the best way to translate them. And instead of a second plate in spit bite, he actually wanted to print them on what's called Shinkele. So if you go to the next, and Shinkele, I have some props because sometimes it's just easier. Shinkele is glued paper. When we're printing on etchings, we print on wet sheets of paper that run through a printing press. Which is just a very solid roller. You can see one in the bottom left corner there. It's a little teeny, no, please go back. There's a little teeny printing press in the corner there. And we print onto normally thicker sheets of paper. So often you'll see they're about 300 grams. That's just a nice solid thick sheet of paper that takes ink beautifully. And when you run an etching through, you're using oil-based ink, but you're using wet paper so that the paper and blanket can be forced into the grooves of the etching to come out the other side and be printed from that copper plate. You can always see the embossing of it. When we're printing on Shinkele, we're printing on a thinner sheet of paper. So here you can see, as an example, I've printed a whole range of somebody's work onto this small sheet of paper, of which we let dry. And in the case of the West Coast landscapes, you can see that William's hand painting every single one of them. So every one of this particular image is ever so slightly different. We've printed everything on these thin sheets of paper. William comes in, hand paints every single one of them. You can see the windmill figure in the background there as well, prior to printing or prior to painting. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see that we're trying to use previous examples kind of to get an idea as to where to hand paint everything, but also that we have tins of ink or little plastic bowls of ink so that there's washes that are happening as it goes. And then after we cut them, we glue the back of these sheets of paper, and then we run them through the printing press and attach them onto thicker backing sheets. Often sheen calais, you can't tell it's there. The reason it's used is for a range of, it's a much thinner sheet of paper, so the ink can sit higher up in the paper because it doesn't get absorbed in the same way. Sometimes it's used as a color backing. You can use sheen calais that's a little bit different color to the thicker sheet of paper it's absorbed onto. You can print color onto that to use it as like a color technique. So there's a whole, if you see process of sheen calais, sometimes it references the kind of paper that it's printed onto. And what it does just mean is that there's an element of collaging loose form, I'm going to say, because you can't tell. It's seamless. So then if you go into the next.
All right. Thank you, Jillian. This is the last work that we have for this evening, and it's a 2006 print called Garibaldi. And I think, Jillian, do you want to run through a little bit of the technical aspects of this work first? I know that it's technically a very, very complicated work. And we don't have too long left this evening, but I think that we will have just long enough to run through some of the context and technicalities of this work.
Much of what what I've been talking about, especially in etching, is here on scale, really. So glued paper, this is 20 lift ground aquatint etchings, which means there are 20 copper plates. Their lift ground means that it was created with the sugar lift technique I was showing you. So what would have happened is that there's 20 sheets of copper. In this case, it's brass. I just know because I've seen the photographs. This was made at Artist Proof Studios, and they lay 20 plates out in front of William, who paints with sugar onto them. They allow that to dry. They put hard ground onto it, lift the sugar off the plates, put them in etching baths. This is printed on 100% Pumani handmade paper, which means Pumani paper is also hand making each of these 20 sheets of paper that this particular piece is printed on. And then each etching mounted on raw cotton cloth, folded as a map and housed in a handmade box covered in raw cotton cloth. So once each of these plates is etched, and with the same look, which I have to tell you, etching, sometimes if it's hot outside, it etches faster. If it's cold outside, it etches slower. So you have to make all 20 of these images in much the same period of time. So the whole team of people that's been working on this project would have been etching these plates over the course of a week, very likely. And hopefully the temperature remains constant so that you get the overall look of the same black or the same gray. And then the scratches that are in the background are dry point scratches where Williams worked directly onto the plates themselves. Then each of these plates is printed one after the other and then glued onto a cloth. And so it's the same kind of as the process of sheen calais, as I was explaining to you, is that everything is just printed on a sheet of paper, much like that, much like this. Glues added onto the back, and instead of adhering this now onto a piece of paper, you've adhered it onto a cloth backing. They're beautiful. They hang almost like tapestries. And I believe that's what Williams even called them before, as kind of a tapestry. And then there's a little bit of hand painting to make sure that in between the seams where the folds actually are, is that there isn't a white gap that exists. So there's a tiny bit of hand painting in these works. But the reason that they can fold up and be put into a cloth box or in a handmade box is because then they're much easier to transport or to store, on top of the fact that it kind of gives that movement that we've been talking about before. So again, it's William working on scale and working on very large etching plates like this. That means you have to have an etching bath that is as big as this particular piece, which is 1.6 meters wide. It doesn't make sense. Often William makes a lot of these larger pieces from smaller pieces. I love that. Personally, we've been exploring that for over 10 years as to how to layer sometimes pieces of paper. And in this case, it's kind of on how an image is layered as a visual sense. So Tammy, I'll let you speak a little bit more about the project, because I hope that that provides just some sort of a understanding as to how it's made.
Thank you, Jillian.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's always difficult to imagine. I mean, it's beautiful to zoom into one image, into one process, but it's always difficult to kind of imagine, as we've been mentioning throughout, that, you know, these projects fold into each other, you know, where the one begins maybe not is where it ends. So as you're saying, this is a 2016 work, but it is part of a much bigger project, looking at the triumphs and laments, which was a public mural in at the River Tiber in Italy. Yeah, if you just want to go one back, I want to mention something which I found very interesting. Throughout, we've been talking about this as Garibaldi. And I found some amazing reference material on the Kentridge Studio website, which has been launched, I think, quite recently, with extensive kind of content. But actually, the image that this is taking from is Victor Emmanuel II, who was the first king of Italy. So then you wonder, who's Garibaldi? And apparently he was a Italian Republican wanting to unify Italy in the 1800s. And he was exiled even for a while, went to South America, came back with a red shirt, kind of adopted this red shirt narrative of the unification of Italy. And throughout you find monuments, not only to Victor Emmanuel II, but to Garibaldi as well. And so kind of speaks about this tension between how does Italy unify, when does it unify, and the kind of impositions of who we monumentalize when kind of these histories and these nations form. So I mean, I think that's all I'm going to mention on this image specifically, but if you want to go to the next one, it kind of speaks more to the final project, which is the mural on the wall of the River Tiber in Rome. And so partly it comes from the research into this history, like the careful thinking and looking at images and where they come from, how they circulate, and then interpreting them in different ways. So in this image, you see the Garibaldi work as the second to last on the right-hand side. And this is William's interpretation of the first king of Italy sitting on a dummy horse being made into a monument. So obviously the actual monument would have a very more a different version of the horse itself, but becomes his interpretation of this moment of making the monument of the first king of Italy. And then each other image becomes other various images that are taken from this unification of Italy, and kind of unpacks the triumphs and laments. How do you sit? How does a city and a country sit with its failures and its successes at the same time? And how do images really narrate that story, or not narrate that story, I guess, is the thing that we're teasing out in looking at these images. But the process is also incredible. I mean, this is a 550-meter long wall. And I guess, as much as we've been talking about printmaking, kind of conflates ideas of drawing, carving, erasure, which we all know to be part of Kentridge's processes. And it's using the actual bacteria on the wall of the River Tiber, which I think is incredible. You're using the air and the fungus of a city to kind of write its images. And I believe this went up in 2016.
Yes.
And I think, Jillian, you mentioned that now it's gone, it's erased. So kind of the permanence and impermanence of the monument, the ephemerality of a city, in a way, becomes constructed in these images. I have a few references to some of the images, but I don't want to really go into it too much. But if you go to the second slide, the next slide, sorry. What I think is also important in this, one back. What I think is also important and interesting in this is it wasn't just historical kind of images. Oh, the next one, please. I know you're on it now. I think it's 38. Yeah, perfect. Is these images kind of also speak to a contemporary history. So the first image you're seeing on the left-hand side is called Migrants and Prisoners, and takes both an so-called ancient image from the 1890s of a shipwreck, and takes the migrant shipwreck of 2013 and kind of juxtaposes them on top of each other, speaking to questions of past and present. As you go further down the image, on the more to the right, you see this body hanging upside down, which was a moment in the 1400s where popes were turned into antichrists, and this is the crucifixion of Saint Peter. And then the last kind of figures you see, the three figures you see there, are the women weeping at the shipwreck of Lampedusa. So this grieving for the loss of people. And this ties again Eritrea, Italy, and the kind of tumultuousness of history and memory and loss, I think very beautifully in one frame. So yeah, quite incredible project, I think. But if you want to go on, I think people can see more clearly kind of the transfer process and the scale of it.
Mm.
And then I'm going to hand over to Joel, because I'm fascinated to hear a bit more about the starting point.
This photograph is taken from William's website, and the Kentridge studio has done an amazing job of the Kentridge studio website, so that you can research a number of these projects and see video photographs from the studio, working process, collaboration, constantly kind of articles, everything that it's a wonderful resource of information. And this photograph is just a really nice way of sharing with the audience how we as collaborators and in printmaking see the project developing in William's studio. So while the Artist Proof Studios was working on the series of large etchings on all these panels of brass that we were just talking about now, David Crute Workshop was simultaneously working on woodcuts, also made of multiple pieces of paper, but also referencing the wall along the Tiber River. And here you can see this is William's working process as to which images will go up on the wall, and along the right side there, you can see he's actually planning where they will go along that wall. So when those of us as collaborators would walk into William's studio, this is how an idea emerges. So how does one unpack this? We haven't seen the work in Rome that is going up on the wall. We see it in stages. We see it sometimes in his sculpture and theater studio in Houghton, or sorry, not in Houghton, at Arts on Main. There, they would have sometimes some of those stencils that you just saw, but that were made in mild steel. So those are hanging from the ceiling. These are all up in his studio. And how do you start a project? Where does it begin? How does an idea evolve? And that's where the conversations between people, between William, I had the most wonderful conversations trying to explore this. William comes with the idea, but often only in hindsight can we actually piece it all together. For me, it's been being in Canada now, I've been able to still watch a lot of what's happening in William's studio, the Center for the Lescott Idea. If you follow that, and you can see his current projects. And that's what I think often people can't quite grasp, is that sometimes you need a little bit of hindsight to be able to understand where they're coming from, because he's working on so many projects simultaneously. But what he is actually allowing is an audience, a way in, so that you're introduced to the work, and only later can you look back at it and try to place it. A lot of the exhibitions are happening overseas. So often the South African audience isn't privy to seeing those museum exhibitions until they eventually come to South Africa. That is just because things are happening all over the place all of the time. It's quite an amazing source, really. And it's all these energies, and it's working with all these different collaborators and sharing working process and how an idea develops into something else. So this was really just to actually share with you often how collaborators get to see what William's working on. And then the next slide, I think, kind of just shows you a few more of his drawings. And then you can see how differently they turn out. So these are charcoal drawings that get made into ink drawings that get made into like a computer vector drawing that gets made into those stencils that go up on the wall. That's a translation from a translation from a translation up onto something larger. Part of his working process. All on these scraps of paper too, often. And then one last slide, please. Oh, sorry, there's two. So this, then you can see how they've planned the wall, and image by image they go up. So they're spraying the wall clean. And so the drawing remains just in the soot, the pollution of what was on the wall. And that's why it's ephemeral. That's why it's disappeared, is that that soot and pollution have covered it up over the last 5 years. And one last slide. This was for the unveiling of this project in April 2016. On the birthday of Rome, actually, William did a performance piece with opera singers and performers that there was two processions, one that came from either end of the from either bridge along these 2 points, and one side was singing songs of remorse, laments, and one song was singing triumphant songs. So then they merged in the middle, and it was this beautiful puppet show that was moving. And as they progressed, you can see how small everyone is along the banks compared to the drawings. And as they came in front of the spotlight, they just became bigger and smaller. So it was this like amazing theater, live theater, amazing performance piece, amazing collaborative work, actually. I don't know how much more to really give you, other than as a visual, and we were lucky enough to be there. So we were able to view the work, not only on the wall of the Tiber, but the performance itself, which was where William becomes more interested in as to what happens with that procession. What happens as these two, the triumphs and the laments, merge? What happens when performance happens? People's responses, everything. So it just grew into the next project, kind of, and all these shadows. And then you start seeing those as sculptural pieces later on. So one project moves into the next, into the next, into the next, very naturally.
Thank you, Jillian. And yeah, that brings our discussion for this evening to an end. And thank you very, very much, Tammy, as well. I think that, yeah, on behalf of Aspire and all of our audience, thank you for your time. That was wonderful to hear your insights and your knowledge. I just wanted to let our audience know, if you want to see any of these works, they are all on show at the moment in our space in Cape Town, 37A Somerset Road in De Waterkant. And they will be on show until the auction next week. The auction is on the 29th and the 30th. This will be in the second session on the 30th. And we'll be open over the long weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So yeah, please come and visit us and look at the Kentridges and all of the other fantastic art that we have up at the moment. It would be lovely to see people. We have reached the end of our time. So I think that perhaps we are not going to open up to questions this evening, but if anybody has a really pressing question that they would like answered, either come and visit us and chat to us about it here, or send me an email at sarah@aspireart.net. And I can always pass it on to Jillian or Tammy and try and get those answered for you. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Jillian, and thank you so much, Tammy. And I hope that everybody enjoyed that as much as I did.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Jillian. It's been a nice time to spend with you.
Yeah, thank you both very much. So.
All right. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.